Don Hall. I'm here with Quyle Kilns with my best bud Pamala Quyle, and she's going to show us how she does press molds, and then she puts those onto drape molds or bump molds to make all sorts of interesting artwork. Say hello, Pamela.
Hi. So I'm Pam Quyle. This is we're in my family business. This is our 68th year as a family pottery, and we're up in Murphy's, California. So my parents moved up here in the 50s to start a studio pottery. I was raised here, and I took over the business about 35 years ago. Along the way, my mother would do most of the throwing, and she would ask me to do all the decorating. And so after I painted as much as I could figure out how to paint and make it interesting, I started wanting to make things that were more three-dimensional. So my mother explained to me about the Romans making molds out of wood that they would press clay into to make figurines. So household gods, they would make a mold of a backside of a figure and the front side of a figure, then pull the clay out, score it and slip it and put it together, and have a figurine that could be done in many sizes. So with that idea in mind, I started making press molds, and I've been making hundreds of them ever since. Some of them are used in mosaic projects, some of them are sprigged or attached to a damp pot. So I'll just start with showing you how to make one.
Great.
So I've set up a table with a lot of different selections of different items. And just for starters, I had a bumblebee mold, and somebody just broke it because it was just too darn thin. And so I made a new one today just by taking this three-dimensional item and pressing it into a fairly thick piece of clay, pulling it off. So I've stamped into it, and then I'll square up the edges and round them, bisque fire it, and then I'll have a mold that I'll have for a bumblebee in the future. So here's an example of, these are little figurines that I purchased in France one year, and they reminded me of my mother's story about the Greeks making statues. So I went ahead and took these molds and I pressed them into clay, and I ended up with a press mold. In this case I have the front, in this case I have a little figure, and I have both the front and the back. So if I press clay into this side and this side, scored them, slipped them together, I'd have one of these, but he'd be smaller because of the shrinkage involved in the firing process. So thinking about the shrinkage again, some years ago I had a Easter bunny, and I liked him, so I pushed him into plaster. I couldn't push him into clay because he was chocolate. But I ended up with a bunny that was kind of too big for anything I needed. So recently I said, oh shit, I really want a little bunny. So I took this bunny, I pressed clay into this mold, and then I pressed him into clay and I made this bunny. Then I pressed that bunny into clay and I made this bunny. Then I pressed that bunny into clay and I made this bunny. Each time I'm firing these in between, so I'm going from a male to a female mold. I worked my way down. I changed the ears. I adapted each one. And finally, I've got down to a bunny that's this big. If I wanted to sprig him onto something that was small, like a coffee mug, he's about the right size.
So each time you fired it gets a little bit smaller.
A little bit smaller. And if I want to, I can high fire my molds, and they'll get even smaller still. And I can still press clay into it, release it to make my male version. So now if I wanted to, I'm gonna grab a hunk of clay. So now all I would do, take the dust out, take a small amount of clay. I try to use just about what I need. Press it into the mold neatly so that I get all my little impressions. I'm going to use my fettling knife and scrape away the rest of the clay. As neatly as I can. Then if I was going to sprig him onto another pot, I'd use a fork or a scoring fork, but I'm using a knife here, and I just go ahead and make my little scoring marks while it's still in the mold. And then generally I could just tap them out. So here I have a little rabbit. He's got a little extra spare on him that I'd be cutting off. But now he's ready to score and slip and apply to a piece of pottery. So,
and that's what you call sprigging?
This is what I call sprigging. So I'm taking a three-dimensional item. It's damp. I'm going to score it. I'm going to score the piece of pottery I'm applying it to, which will also be damp, and then I'm going to press the two of them together. So once again, when I wanted to make dogwoods for cups for our local park system, I made a big male version, a big dogwood, and I made a couple of them. Then I made press molds of those. Then I ended up with smaller dogwoods. I applied this one to just to another piece of clay to make a smaller mold, and I can change it each time. I can add the leaves, I can change the centers, I can make the petals move because it's all just in clay. So here's a piece that's now sprigged onto a mug. The base clay is going to be golden, but because the flower is going to be white, I just sprig it in white clay. Likewise, when I'm doing pine cones, for example, these are molds that I made with a real pine cone into clay, and then I used a dark red clay in my mold so that when I apply it to the surface, I don't have to color it. It's already colored in dark red clay. So it just saves me the effort of having to paint the darn thing. By using 2 or 3 different colors of clay, you can get some very interesting results. So a lot of potters, myself included, love having different stamps to use, and a lot of us own a stamp collection. I certainly do. Sometimes I find, though, that the stamp might not be just the size I want, and once again, I'm going to show you that you can take your stamp, you can make a press mold out of your stamp, and then you can make a stamp out of your press mold. So it's quite simple. So last night I took this stamp, well, previously I took this stamp, and I had made this mold with this stamp. I have a couple of these wooden birds that we got from, I don't know, someplace in the 60s, I think. So now I have a mold. I have the original stamp, but now if I stamp clay into my mold and I leave myself a little handhold, now I can fire this. It's going to get smaller, and I'm going to have a piece that's going to be smaller than the original. So I could have the same bird in multiple sizes, and that's what I think is fun. Here's another wooden stamp that we got someplace, Costco, I don't know, someplace. Here's my clay stamp, because I made a mold of this. Now a stamp I made from that mold. Now I have the same flower in 2 sizes. So I could start to think of myself as making a bouquet with flowers in different sizes, so not everything is so rigid. And if I wanted to, you could carve it differently or change it while it's in the damp process. You can use all sorts of things. So here's a metal piece that was supposed to be some sort of a medallion, and I just pressed this into clay. Because it's metal and it could have stuck, I used a little bit of talc as I pressed it into the clay. But now I can press clay into this, and I can make this green man design, and I can change it, and I can change the face or add more leaves or adjust it to suit myself. Likewise, here's a soap. I pressed this into clay probably 40 years ago, and then I've made smaller versions of it, but it's something that was in my bathroom. I went, oh look, I can do that. So here's another just handmade stamp. I could make a mold of this. I could make another stamp of it. You can be as ornate as you want to. Here's one that is a Christmas ornament that I had on a Christmas tree. And so I pressed the ornament into clay. I've now made a stamp from it. Now I can make another female press mold from this stamp, and that'll give me a smaller version of this, which might be more appropriate for most of the size pieces that I'm making. Okay, so now that you've seen using small sprig molds and what you can possibly do to apply them to other pieces of pottery, I realized that I could start working larger and perhaps make a whole piece in a press mold or a bump mold that I'd carve from an original work or from something else. So here is a mold that's a hump mold that I started out with a 79-cent plastic dish from the grocery store. And I put clay in it. I made it good and sturdy. And then I can patty cake clay down onto it. I draped it a little bit more, but I ended up being able to make a slightly curved piece with the same motif. So although I was using a plastic commercial piece, you could create your own original master very nicely. So here's a couple other examples where I just created an original master. I live in frog country. Everybody in the county wants things with frogs on them. So I made a bump mold with a frog So now when I patty cake clay down onto this mold, I can get a shallow dish with a three-dimensional frog on it. Likewise, I kind of like fruits and flowers and things, so I made a bump mold with grapes and strawberries and other fruits around it. I can patty cake clay down onto that, a slab, and then I can take this whole piece over to the potter's wheel, which allowed me to just throw a foot on it. So I can take my original work, throw a little bit of a foot on it. I can pull it off when it starts to shrink. You make sure you get it off before it shrinks and cracks, and then you can decorate it to suit yourself. So I did quite a lot of these fruit dishes over the years. Here's a smaller version with its hump mold. So so you can do anything. So these are a little bit of frou-frou, but you could certainly do it geometric just as nicely, or a portrait, or almost anything. You carve it first, three-dimensionally as a male, make a female out of it, and then you can make another male. You just have to work larger than you think you're going to need. So back to the idea of using found items or odd things. I like making faces and I like making masks. And so what I discovered was, if I had to start each face totally from scratch and get the nice oval for a face and lay in the general idea of the eyes and nose and mouth, it would take me longer than I wanted to do, because I have to make work that I have to quickly to sell. So I got a styrofoam head. We've all seen a million of these. Okay, now taking a styrofoam head like this, I created a mold that is a press mold. So this mold, then I put sides on it to make it sturdy, because I'm going to be really pounding clay into it. So it's like a dog dish with sturdy sides. And then what I get from this mold is this simplified face. Now I adjusted it obviously a little bit in the mold so that the lips were a little bit more defined and the eyes were a little more defined. But then from this point, I can pull this and I can change this to any different type of woman's features that I choose to. Okay, here's another example. A friend of mine made this one. This was her original art piece, and then we made a mold from it. Now we did get a crack down the middle, but it really doesn't matter. So this was the original piece. We bisque fired it, then we made a press mold from it. Now when I press clay into it, I'm going to get a face that's somewhat smaller than this, but we went heroic size knowing that we were going to do this process. So this face is bigger than our end products will be. So some years ago, probably 30 now, I was hand carving a lot of plates with half dome on them, and I was having problems with them cracking because I was hand building, well, throwing a big platter, then carving into it all the stones and rocks and carving back. And I discovered that it was just too problematic. So I had a photograph bigger than this, but that I took, and then I blew up the photograph, and then I traced it backwards onto plaster. And then I carved the plaster away so that I had the three-dimensional aspects that I wanted. This is on a plaster bump, but it's the same process. I would be patty caking clay down onto this, then I can put it on my potter's wheel and I can throw a foot ring on it. I did the same thing years ago, 35 years ago. It was a kitty cat that was cute off of a cat food bag, and I just carved it backwards into a plaster mold. So then I have versions of these as a finished pieces, which are down here. So here's, this is just red iron oxide, high fired on a cream colored clay. And I did them both in color and oxides. And this was the same, it was just, but this is, I use engobes rather than underglazes. So I paint while the clay is just at the greenware stage, and with engobes and fire it, and then a clear glaze over the surface. So in the continuity or the continuation of things that you can do with clay that you wouldn't think about it, I just put a piece of clay onto this where I had rolled a piece of pine bark, and now I have a press of that pine bark, which is actually kind of interesting and could almost be used for feathers. Actually, if I was upside down, feathers or some other textural thing. So this is just using what I have easily at hand, which is firewood, because I live in the mountains. And then I have another piece of firewood. I just couldn't burn a few years ago was this piece of cedar, and it just had such a cool knot hole in it that I said, hell, what can I do with that? So I brought it over here and I made a press mold of that piece of wood. So since I live in the mountains and I have fire to build every day, every so often I'll see some piece of firewood in my stack and I go, ooh, that's kind of pretty. So I just really like this one. I like the knot hole. I liked the texture around it. So I brought it over and I made a clay mold just from the piece of wood. So I took a flat, heavy, flat slab and I compressed it into the wood, and I ended up with this odd but functional mold. So then I just had put this clay into it earlier today, and so this, you can see, is going to be the opposite, or the other version of that. Okay, but here's what I did with it, is I went ahead and made my slab here, and that's this piece on here. This little mouse I stuck in because there was enough of a gap there. So although I've been using clay and stamps and a lot of other things, you don't have to limit yourself to just using clay as your original medium. So in this case, I have several linoleum blocks that have been in my life for years. And I thought, well, I don't have a way to really print them on paper, nor am I that interested, but I can press clay into the linoleum block. Of course, I do a bigger slab, but when I pull it off, it's hard to see, but I've got the clouds and the little houses here and this hillside. So here's an example right here of this same block with clay pressed into it and then some color to define it. So of course it's a reverse because it's a print, and what goes up is down on the finished piece, which you could think about if you really wanted something to be raised, then you do it the opposite if you're cutting your own linoleum block.
So this is not only colored, it's also textured.
Correct.
It has the
From
same
being
texture
pressed
as
into the linoleum block. So here's another one that I've used many times. And so everything's going to be either up or down, and you just have to get a good press in, and it'll remove quite easily from the wood, and you color it and you have a wall hanger.
Well, thank you, Pamela. That was really, really informative.